Okay, so welcome for coming. We'll start with the discussion on housing crisis. Generally talking, more specifically talking, me and Christian, I'll introduce him and myself a little bit later. We'll be talking about connection between finances and housing globally, and I'll try to connect it also to Slovenia. So just for a brief introduction about the topic. So as we all know, most of you here are younger. Housing crisis is something that we are experiencing really concretely with our own lives, and it is something that in the last decade has become like a common feature of how cities and also countries are functioning. So we can be talking about the return of the housing question, while in the past, for those of us who are studying the topic, the idea was that housing question was solved permanently in the 70s. That was the main idea, so that housing question is over, we can move forward. But how things have turned on, and Christian will explain more about it, the housing crisis is something that is getting worse and worse. And also where the starting point, also one interesting starting point is, it is connected to COVID. COVID crisis is something that exacerbated housing crisis. It became more visible. Firstly, because homes suddenly got new functions, or certain functions became more visible. So we are not able to quarantine ourselves if we don't have safe houses. But at the same time, we don't have access to it. So this is something that you should be thinking about. So how the housing and COVID is connected, while us will be discussing about more general topics about housing. So I forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Klemen Ploštajner. I'm a PhD student in the Faculty of Social Science, and about these topics that I talked a little bit briefly in the introduction, I'll be discussing with Christian Koutny. He's a PhD student in economics at Kingston University of London, where he is researching financialization of housing. So the idea how we will do it today is that we'll have two short presentations, 10 minutes, let's say, maybe 15 minutes, we'll see. Presentations, both of us. First one will go Christian, second one will go myself. After that, we will have a brief discussion about topics that we'll open up in this two introductory papers, let's say, if we want to be academic. And after that, we will open the floor for the questions. How we will do it is, because we are recording it, you will ask the question loudly, and I will repeat it into the microphone, so the people who will be watching it on the video will also be able to hear it. So without further ado, I'll give the word to Christian.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to give a bit of a introduction in what I think is theoretically happening, kind of like where we can locate theoretically the origins of the housing crisis. So it's going to be quite theoretical, but I hope you can follow, and you can obviously ask questions afterwards if you can't follow some parts. And thank you very much for the invitation, of course. I'm very humbled, and I will start. So the start for the argument I want to make is that capitalism as a world system is experiencing an overaccumulation crisis. Starting somewhere in the 1970s or 1980s, due to many different reasons, capital struggled to find profitable realms for investment. Usually, capitalists will produce and sell commodities, exchange them against money on the market, and then buy and expand machinery in order to produce and sell at better conditions in higher quantities. This mechanism implies that both production and the mass of capital is ever increasing. In an overaccumulation crisis, capitalists struggle to increase their productive activities through those traditional forms of buying more machinery, etc., etc. However, capital cannot stop expanding. If it does, the system is in a crisis. For Marx, a crisis is rooted in the contradictory tendencies of capital accumulation. Therefore, crises are not caused by external factors or by flaws within the dynamics of capitalism, but by its very nature. The very contradictions that cause crises are also central characteristics and means of capital to reproduce and expand itself. Thus, there's no capitalism without regular crises. Importantly, crises are regularly overcome by a reorganization of capital and society as a whole. Such a reorganization can be expressed in many ways, such as the subordination of additional moments or aspects of social reproduction to capital, a change in the relationship between states and capital, or any other way of evolutionary reorganization that allows capital to overcome those pre-existing barriers of accumulation caused by those contradictions that are at its very heart and center. What always holds true is that the new form of capitalism is born out of the old form of capitalism. In a general crisis, where there are accumulated unsolved contradictions of several past recessions embodied, this demands a much larger devaluation of the capital stock and, importantly, a much more fundamental reorganization of capitalism as a whole. The crisis of the 1970s was such a general crisis. It was a crisis of overaccumulation, where capital struggled to find new outlets for profitable investments. As already mentioned, this means that capital has to reorganize itself to continue its daily business of expansion. Neoliberalism and the deregulation of markets and pensions constitute one of such attempts to overcome the overaccumulation crisis. Financialization constitutes another of such attempts to overcome an overaccumulation crisis. In financialization, what is financialization is the next paragraph. So in financialization, we describe something like previously fixed capital in the form of machinery, stocks, or infrastructure is now either sold or the maintenance and expansion of this fixed capital is discontinued. Thereby, this capital is transferred into liquid financial capital, which is much more mobile, fluid, and fast. This allows capital to locate realms for profitable investment much more quickly and easily. Historically, the previous phase of financialization can be located in the middle to the end of the 19th century, and Lenin coined this phenomenon as imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Back then and today, capital does not find profitable realms to manifest itself in physical production. Back then and today, physical capital is transformed into liquid capital in order to locate and find new realms where it can be manifested. Back then and today, violence is applied to subordinate ever more value, which was previously located outside of the logic of capital, to the logic of capital. Back then it was imperialism and colonialism. Today it is the selling of council homes and the eviction of people due to following insolvencies. Back then and today, the limits of what is possible are violently expanded. Back then and today, huge amounts of money are looking for profitable ways to be invested. Back then and today, capital finds profitable realms for its self-expansion. In the United Kingdom, house prices skyrocketed since the 1990s. Council homes were sold off and are still sold off without any new ones being built. Wages are stagnating or declining, and households turn from net savers into net debtors, with the stock of household debt, so like the total amount of household debt, exceeding a year's worth of total production, GDP. In the US, households without any forms of regular income were nudged into taking on mortgages and found themselves homeless, but with impossibly repayable debt only a couple of years later. The world stood still when big private companies went bankrupt and the biggest bailouts in the history of nation states were made, while millions lost their homes and future. In Spain, hotels were built, house prices reached unimaginable levels, and people found themselves unable to pay for their shelter. The state of Greece found itself unable to take on new debt because the market decided to stop lending and as a result had to give away its assets and the people of Greece their pensions to German banks to keep the expansion of financial capital going. Financialization is the shift from the production of tangible commodities, something you can touch, towards trade of financial assets and shares. As we have developed earlier, this shift can be located somewhere in the 1970s. Of course, capital is ever expanding, and considering that it's the mass of capital which is expanding at a certain rate, its expansion follows an exponential growth path. Because the expansion of capital follows an exponential growth path, the mass of and the value of the financial assets subordinated to the logic of capital also have to grow exponentially. With housing, capital found a particularly good capital assets. Nowadays, housing is sold on the market like any other commodity. It's sold and then bought and then sold again before anyone would ever use it as shelter. The fact that housing is also a means for shelter makes it a quite peculiar type of asset or commodity. Economic theory so far does not think that that matters. It treats housing similar to oil or any other random financial assets, with its use value being more disguised or abstract. Its price is said to be determined by supply and demand, with demand and supply being higher when prices are rising. The fact that it's also shelter, housing, is a really annoying aspect of it, which means that some houses have to be reserved for charity, which do not follow all rules of the market. Naturally, the amount of housing outside the circulation of capital has to be kept at an absolute minimum. Remember, the mass of housing has to increase constantly to keep up with the self-expansion of capital looking for profitable realms to invest. We know that debt and housing are interrelated. Houses are bought with credit. Higher house prices will lead to higher indebtedness as long as banks are willing to lower the standards due to the optimism into the future of the market and the state's willingness to bail them out in case of emergency. In practically all industrialized countries, house prices and indebtedness of household grew simultaneously from a similarly low level to a much higher level, at a similarly very high rate of growth. The idea is that the more expensive houses become, the more credit households have to take on in order to finance the housing, which they can also use as shelter. At the same time, easier access to credit leads to higher house prices, because the more people are able to and want to buy a house, the higher prices can go. Such easier access to credit can occur through the deregulation of the banking system, with households having ever easier access to credit. However, this can also happen through state policy, where the state supports people to buy property. That's maybe something we talk about later. The fact that housing development is usually in the hands of a handful of developers ensures that the supply of houses is always short of the demand for housing. The state ensures that if the market for housing ever collapses, banks and companies are safe. The state unleashes its violence and dispossesses people unable to repay their debts, and thereby ensure the continuation of the accumulation by dispossession, the oldest and most central form of capitalist expansion. This makes housing this very peculiar financial asset. On the other hand, it's shelter and thereby a basic need for human beings to reproduce themselves. This means people will continue to buy housing as long as it is financially somehow bearable. The profit-making aspect plays very little role there. However, housing is also a financial commodity and is bought specifically and only for profit-making. This means its demand increases when the price increases, and the demand decreases when the price decreases. So, because of people speculating on houses, the price rises when demand rises and falls when demand falls. And this works like a spiral, where higher prices lead to even higher prices and lower prices to even lower prices. However, Lower prices also lead to lower supply and thus to less construction. Lower prices also lead to lower indebtedness and to lower investment opportunities for liquid capital looking for profitable realms to invest. The state, in all its complexities, is also a market maker and also greatly concerned with the continuation of economic growth. With housing being such a major contributor to economic growth through construction and through being a sponge for capital on the one hand, but also through consumption, houses have to be furnished, etc. The state is, of course, interested in the continuation of this. However, economic crises, of course, do not repeat themselves, which is why a 2007-style housing crisis is rather unlikely. The state has nonetheless learned that housing as a commodity has to continue and shall not be disturbed. House prices continue to rise, banks continue to lend to ever lower standards, and people find themselves with ever smaller choices other than to participate in this madness. At the same time, ever more housing blocks and skyscrapers shoot out of the ground like mushrooms, usually remaining largely uninhabited. David Harvey, a famous Marxist political economist, coined this as mindless, stupid urbanization. The contemporary capitalist economy is essentially driven by housing, and the industrial business cycle is in sync with the housing cycle. Consumption depends on people taking out higher debts against higher housing prices and on people furnishing their houses. Pension funds, and thus people's old age security, depends on rising house prices as a form of profitable investments for those pension funds. Societies go into lockdown, but building sites and estate agents continue to operate because empty flats need to be built and sold. When the housing stops, the party stops. We saw this in the past, and we shall not repeat this exercise. I will come to an end now. The point is the following. Capital needs profitable realms. This can be a factory and its machinery, or it can be financial assets. Without expansion, there's no capital. Currently, capital reorganizes itself and thus is held liquid, not in the form of machinery. Housing presents itself as one of the major sponges for all of this capital searching for profitable realms. The state ensures the capital can continue to expand itself and will thus ensure that the housing market will not collapse. The contemporary capitalist economy relies on a housing market to expand, not because there's a demand for shelter, but because there's a demand for profitable realms for liquid capital.
Thank you, Christian. I will follow up basically on what you said. So Christian basically explained how overaccumulation of capital and housing are interconnected, and how the way housing is built and transformed into basically financial instruments and the way of investing is connected to the general condition in the capitalist system, where the capital is always overaccumulating. What I would like to talk a little bit more about, to bring these abstract processes more concretely down to earth and connect it more concretely to different housing systems, and how these abstract terms of capitals are being translated into concrete housing relations in different countries, let's say. So one of the main things that we're witnessing right now, and what Christian basically described, is interconnection, more thorough interconnection between finances and housing. And one of the manifestations of this, where we can basically test this interconnection between finances and housing, is global synchronization of housing prices, which is a new phenomena. In the past, housing markets were usually conceptualized and were separated. So what was happening in Ljubljana was separated from what was happening in Paris, London, Vienna, New York. And the circulation of prices and volatility of prices was quite different in different places on Earth. While now, in the last couple of years, we are witnessing how these global prices are getting more and more synchronized, which means that they are more and more connected to the global financial markets. What that means that local markets, which were separated, now need to be translated into global terms and global ideas, something that can be visible, understandable in different locations. That means that local markets in Ljubljana, their conditions need to be translated, if I say with probably the way that economists think, not this economist, but most of the casual ones, they need to be translated into Excel spreadsheets. But this translation is not something that is done easily, but it's a quite complex process. The way that we also see this, how these global finances are integrated into housing, there are just a couple of data that I think will help us to understand, to think a little bit about that. In 2020, 30% of all housing in Europe was bought by institutional investors. These are investors usually, like Christian explained, pension funds, investor funds, so companies, financial companies. In Ireland, that more than 70% of housing in 2020 was bought by institutional investors. We have a company, couple of them, but the most famous one, Blackstone, which is investing in different countries in different areas of the world. So they have the ability to understand really particular local markets, which are quite hard to read even for us as locals. For example, if I go to buy a flat or rent a flat in Maribor, I don't know a lot about what is happening in Maribor because I was living in Ljubljana for 10 years. I stayed in Maribor a couple of times. For me, it's quite hard to understand what is the real worth of certain housing in Maribor. So how come Blackstone, a company with which is coming from United States, is able to understand what is the value of housing in different areas of the world? So that Blackstone is present in UK, Spain, Germany, Ireland, US. There needs to be a certain mechanism of translating local conditions to global ideas, let's say. And also one Slovenian interesting one, we in the fall, so in a couple of months, we'll be getting our first real estate investment fund, Equinox it's called, which is something entirely new for Slovenia. And at their presentation, they said they have 3 main goals that they want to follow. First one is, obvious one, to make profit for our shareholders. Second one is to make profits for banks that will lend us money to buy housing or other real estate. And the third one is our social mission to provide housing for people. So we see how the housing is subordinated to other 2 goals. So if then the main thing that I want to talk now, as I already pointed out, is how are these local conditions translated into global ideas, global understanding, and then how the feedback loop basically is influencing how housing markets are operating in the different locations. So that housing can be traded as a financial asset and understand as a financial asset, it firstly needs to become a commodity. And to be a commodity, it means that it needs to be tradable. So there needs to be ability to trade this thing for another thing. And the main condition for it to be tradable is firstly that there needs to be a way to translate it to the common denominator, which means money. We're able to value different housing on different locations with the same value system, and that system is money system. Or money symbol, let's say, that would be a better word for it, money symbol. So we're able to compare housing in Ljubljana, in Paris, in London, in different locations, because they are translated to the common denominator, money. But this translation, which is necessary for the financial markets to operate and their ability to invest in different locations, needs to be done by particular actors. So we have international companies that do this translation. So we have like Knight and Frank, Ernst & Young, so global companies which are basically analyzing local markets and translating them into similar data. What kind of yield does the local market have? What kind of profitability? How much does the housing cost and stuff like that? Another example of this translation is the web page RDNA, which is used by investors in the Airbnb housing. So you can check the RDNA, you can go to the RDNA webpage, and you can then compare different housing on different locations. You can see that in Ljubljana you will be able to buy a flat for 200,000, the yield will be 5%, while if you buy it in San Francisco, you will pay 400,000, but the yield will be 7%. So you can, as a global investors, have the ability to compare different housing. So this is one thing that needs to occur. But what is particularly interesting that there is also a feedback loop. It is not only a translation of what is currently present, but as Christian also explained, there is also a way, influences the way housing is being built and used. So the housing that is now being built is more built with the thought of yields, profits, and more of in comparison to different locations. So also where housing is being built for international capital, it is also comparing different locations where it is profitable to invest, and then global financial institutions invest in those markets. So there is a feedback loop, not only how what already exists is being translated into global ideas, but also how these global financial markets are influencing what kind of housing is being produced. Then second thing that is necessary for the commodity to exist, and to exist especially as a financial instrument or as an asset, is there needs to be clearly defined private property. So private property laws needs to be clearly defined in certain areas. Without that, we are not able to know what we are trading. So that's why the property register maps are extremely important for financial markets. They need to know what they're trading in. But what is interesting here is that private property is not something that is just given, that is it or is it not, but it's something that we can think of as on a spectrum. There is more private property, certain objects are more held in private property or less. That is because property or private property particular is not the relation towards things, but it's relation towards people. For example, this is my private property, mobile. It's not because I use it in a particular way, but it is because I am the only one who can use it, and I am excluding all of you from the usage of it. I can give you to use it for a couple of minutes, but you need to give it back to me. So we have a certain social relations through this object, let's say. We can also see this in a company, for example. Workers are working on the machinery, they do all the work, while the profit is appropriated by the owner of the company, so the owner of the machinery. This is also one aspect of the private property. Who is able to appropriate wealth from it? And this is important to understand. Private property in this way is important when it comes to housing, is because the way the private property works, it's kind of flexible. It can be more or less private. It can be limited by social function of property, by ecological function of property, or it cannot, or it isn't. It is just private property for appropriation of wealth. And when it comes to housing, it is especially insidious because most of the value of housing comes from the location where the housing is located. And location is not produced by the owner of the house, but the collective activity of all the people in a certain city. For example, luxury housing in the center of Ljubljana, let's say Anderlicht, or I'll use a better example. The new housing that will be built in front of Rog, the ex-squat, are already marketing themselves as housing that will be in front of the new gallery places and new park that will be built by the city. So the value of those homes that will be built by Pristop, so the advertising agency, the value of that housing will be higher because they are located to something that the city has built and the city citizens will use. But the value will be appropriated privately. So this is also important when it comes to, for example, rental market. How strict are the private property laws enforced? is a owner of the house, has a total control over the property and can kick out the renter at whichever time he pleases. This is also one important aspect when we think how hard the private property is enforced. And the more it is enforced by the state, and also Christian also talked a little bit about how the state is doing this through violence, the more it is enforced, the stronger is private property, the easier way is to translate it to financial instruments, and the easier way is to commodify it. And the last mechanisms that we need to understand and to also connect to the particular conditions of housing market is liquidity, which means how quickly a certain unit of housing can be turned into money, either by selling it or by renting it out as quickly as possible. And this is also, it's on the spectrum. It can be more or less liquid, and it depends on how financial markets are structured in a certain country. For example, in Slovenia, we don't have a lot of financial instruments to speculate with housing, while in UK, United States, there are a lot of different instruments where you can extract value from your home. Another way of making housing more liquid, it would be to deregulate the rental market. The quicker you can change renters, the quicker you can put on a higher rent on it, the more liquid the home is, the more value you can extract from it. If the rents are regulated, we all know that for a certain period of time you will pay X amount of money for this unit of housing. While if they are regulated, you can increase and increase and increase, and this you can extract more value from home. It also goes to the construction. Now we can go back to Anderlicht that I that I mentioned before. So probably the most famous real estate investor in Slovenia, I would say, maybe, definitely in Ljubljana. So when it comes to to construction, and also the more is liquid when there is a less strict enforcement of certain rules. For example, if there is no enforcement of protection of council housing or cultural heritage or people that are living already in a certain housing, if an investor comes, buys cheaply certain property, can quickly demolish it without any consequences and build luxury housing, this means this plot of land is more liquid. It means it can be more quickly turned into money. If we go to the Anderlicht example, he destroyed one cultural heritage, important cultural building in the center of Ljubljana. He promised that he will build he will build some amount of housing, but mostly he will build new cultural, like he said he will build opera, I think, yeah. But he was speculating so long, and the state was so keen that he finishes the project that in the end he is now, I think from a couple of days ago, the state said he doesn't need to build any cultural institutions anymore, any cultural places. He can just build luxury housing on that plot of land. Here we see how this plot of land changed its liquidity because of the particular political situations and how he was able to negotiate. So my point being is that how this connection between financial markets and housing is being done, we can see it in how housing systems operate in different countries and historically how they changed. If they are becoming more and more deregulated, if the private property is more and more enforced, if investors are able to change the usage of certain units more quickly and kick out renters, if they are able to kick out indebted owners quickly out of the housing and sell them dearly, this is one of the ways how housing is getting financialized and how this financialization is getting more and more concrete, let's say. And for the last point, we can see how housing systems in most of the countries are changing, in which direction, how is this financialization is influencing how housing systems are changing. With raw numbers, we can basically say. We have a fall in public ownership of housing in the last 30 years. It's not only public ownership, but let's say protected housing, that sort of housing that is being protected by regulation. which is usually public housing. In UK, it was council housing. In Slovenia, it was, I don't know how it's translated, družbena stanovanja. So it means the state-owned flats. So we have the lower and lower levels of this protected housing, let's say. We also have a fall in home ownership, but also changing in the form of home ownership, because homeowners are thinking of their housing more and more as assets. They're using also their housing as assets to speculate, individual speculations from households. So the fall in home ownership. And the third thing, which is for us that are researching housing, the most peculiar one and the most interesting one, is the rise of private rental market, which in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, all politicians were saying that the private rental market will wither away. We had euthanasia of renters. Landlordism was basically dead, because in all countries, landlordism was falling, while now in the last years we see a quite high rise in private rental market. And what is the most interesting thing is we have two ways how it is rising. First one is by not only the well-off households, but also this, let's say, upper middle class households who are buying additional flats for individual security. And second one is the companies that I started with, so institutional investors. And when Equinox, for example, they're saying they will build 100 new housing units, rental housing unit in Ljubljana, that will be probably the first example of institutional investors owning housing in Ljubljana. So this is my last point that I wanted to make. Now, because we haven't touched the main topic of this festival, which is the state, we haven't touched it much. Our idea is now to try to more concretely talk about this, what we talked a little bit more abstractly, to more concretely represent it through two cases. So Christian, I wanted to ask you if you can connect what we were talking about a little bit more about British examples, so how the British housing system has changed. And after that, I'll a little bit talk about Slovenia, how we can see this slow transition in Slovenia.
So in the UK, actually, especially in London, but as far as I know, like all over the country, in the 50s and 60s, they had like huge amounts of social housing. Like especially if you walk around in London, like it's crazy. Like everywhere you have those social housing blocks. And so this means, I mean, a social housing block, of course, it's outside of the logic of capital, because it's the municipality or the state, whoever, kind of like rents it, and maybe the level of rent and many other things don't follow logics of capitalism, logics of capital, but it follows the logic of providing shelter. And then in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher came up with the idea to sell off the council homes. So like people who lived in a council flat were allowed to buy their own council flat. So like if you have a social house from your municipality, you were allowed to buy it and then it's yours. Which is of course already some type of contradiction, because if you have enough money to buy your social house, then maybe you should just buy a different house. And that was simultaneously with a stop of with stopping building new social houses. So the existing stock of social houses was sold off, and no new social houses were being built. That's what I meant earlier with the state, with kind of like more and more of the social housing, more and more of housing being subordinated to the logics of capital. Because as soon as a private person can own a house, which means they can also sell it to someone else, they can rent it to someone, they can do whatever they want with it, because of course it's private property. So you can do whatever you want with your private property in the UK. And so from then on, it follows the logic of capital. From then on, you want prices to rise, because if prices rise, you can sell it higher and maybe buy a second house or a third house. So that was in the 1980s, and then loads of people started buying their council houses. Maybe some of you maybe know the Barbican Centre in London, like a very beautiful kind of utopianist style, brutalist social housing block. And flats to rent there now is like a 1-bedroom is whatever, 1700 a month to rent. And then the UK experienced the problem that houses were became so expensive that that a large amount of people were not able to either pay rents or to buy a house because they were too expensive because of the lack of social housing, and all of that was sold off. So they came up with this great idea to do a help to buy scheme, because the financial markets, the banks, they kind of like they have a minimum amount of money you need to have as a deposit. You need to put 10% at least of the value of your house, of the value of the mortgage. You need to have in cash to get the mortgage. But then most people couldn't afford this 10% of the value of the house anymore. So the British state now helps you with this deposit. So you only need like an even smaller amount of cash in order to buy a house, in order to get the mortgage for a house, which means demand. Through that, of course, to further stimulate demand, people continue to buy their houses. And of course, through that, prices are further rising and further rising. And of course, in 20 years' time, you will have again the problem that when prices are even higher, that people again will not be able to pay this minimum amount of deposit, even with the help of the state. And then maybe, I don't know, the state will pay for all of it. I don't know. But the point is that this whole housing system and the economy, especially in the UK and in America, relies to such a major extent on housing that the prices can never, like they cannot fall. Once prices in the housing market fall, the kind of like the system collapses. And so, of course, what do you do as a state who is interested in the continuation of that? You stimulate and stimulate further. I think that's a very, very extreme example.
Can you also talk a little bit about the tenant market, so renters market, private renter market, and especially how the state is also contributing to the rise in rental prices through buy-to-let schemes and subsidizing? Because you have basically, the way I understand, the UK system is based on housing benefits, so that you can get quite a lot of subsidies from the state, either as a landlord for buying a flat, or as a tenant also to be able to pay your rent. I'm interested in this because in Slovenia the state wants to go in that direction, and would like to hear what does it mean.
I mean, to be honest, I actually don't know much about this buy-to-let scheme, and also don't know much about this how the housing benefits work in particular in the UK. I mean, I know that you get housing benefits. You can use your housing benefits to pay for any flat. I guess the state intervention in the UK is maybe like just is very extreme in terms of like how the law works really in favor of the landlord. And I actually have maybe an interesting anecdote. It's like I once rented a flat or a room in London with a landlord, and everything was very dodgy, and I had to pay my rent in cash. So it was kind of like I didn't have a contract or anything. And I actually got along really well with my landlord, because of course the landlord wasn't able to go to the police or whatever. Like if there would be a problem, if some of us weren't able to pay the full amount of rent, or if some of us were like 1 or 2 weeks late with paying for our rent, the landlord wasn't able to go to court or to go to the police and for the police to kick in your door and throw you out of your home. But you had to solve it on an informal level. And I personally kind of like got along much better with that. And then I had another flat with a actually very nice landlord. He was like a doctor, and he worked in like some NGO style doctor for like undocumented migrants, so like a potentially nice person. And we asked for like a very small reduction, like less than 10% of the rent for like 8 months during the last pandemic, during the last lockdown. And of course the landlord said no, because of course the landlord knows if I don't pay, he goes to court, the police comes 2 weeks later, I'm out, they kick in my door, they change my locks, my possessions I can collect somewhere later. And he's fully aware of that, and he has fully internalized that. And at our last conversation, he was complaining that I was a bit rude to him because he's such a nice person. And I'm still not nice to him. Because of course, for him, being a nice person means allowing me to occupy his property. Because in the UK, when you rent the flat, the idea really is that it's someone else's property. And you pay them money in order to use it for a limited amount of time. It's not your home. Because in my home, like the estate agent, like some weeks ago, estate agents came by my flat to do an inspection. Like someone just comes into your home and looks around whether everything is okay with you. Or kind of how you treat the place. And I mean, it's in your home, you maybe like, I mean, I don't have many possessions because I'm precariously da-da-da. But I mean, if this would be like my proper home, I maybe have like things that I don't want other people to see in this flat. But they kind of like that's not the idea that it's your home. The idea is to get a limited amount of access to this flat, and as soon as you stop paying, or as soon as there's any troubles, someone will come and kick you out, and you can look for yourself.
This what you were talking about, your experience as a renter, also explains why you have in UK financial investors that are investing in rentals market, and why in Slovenia we don't have them. First, because there is a lot of informality. Most of the rental agreements in Slovenia are done sort of informal in a shady way, and these financial companies are not able to translate this informality into financial assets. While in the UK you have a lot of formal agreements, you know how everything stands, and this can be translated into financial assets. And also you said that if you stop paying, immediately someone comes, goes to court with you, changes the locks. While in Slovenia, it's supposed to be quite hard to get your tenant out of your an apartment, even though he or she is not paying the rent. Our court system is working slowly. It's quite hard, supposedly, to kick the renters out. And this is one of the really important things for the financial investor to know, that if the tenant is not paying rent, I can kick him out immediately and get a new one in. So that's why maybe the stories that we hear from the UK are much more extreme, because there is an Excel spreadsheet timetable basically on it, while in Slovenia there is more informality and we are more able to negotiate. I found one really interesting quote that is more connected probably to the second example that you told about, these two nice doctors, but who are still landlords. And I found from the pamphlet that is talking about there is no such thing as a good landlord, and it's also it takes the idea from there is no such thing as a good capitalist, even though he's bringing you flowers every day to the company or buying you bread or whatever, he's still your employer. So the quote is about landlord: under no duress the landlord takes it upon themselves to behave like a hand sanitizer hoarder. The example is, during the pandemic, people were hoarding hand sanitizers and selling them really dearly to people who needed them because there was a lack of it. They acquire ownership of pre-existing home, simultaneously preventing anyone who might want to live in the property themselves from doing so, in hope their ownership will enable them to make money out of those in need. That they encumber themselves with mortgage debt or use up their saving to achieve this morally dubious aspiration is their choice, for which they need to take personal responsibilities. When landlords choose to behave in this way, society has no obligation to indulge or humor their behavior. On the contrary, we have a moral obligation to deter such antisocial acts. If people hoarded food on the basis of its value was sure to go up when others began to starve and would pay anything, we would stop their hoarding. But hoarding is now happening with shelter in the most unequal and affluent parts of the world. So I find this quote really, really interesting, and I think that it summons up basically this individual condition, so the relation between the landlord and the tenant. What I'm wondering about, and what my more general question is, how come, if the topic is again the state, what's your opinion? Why is state allowing this to happen? Why? So what's basically the role of the state, and why does it allow for the housing markets to operate in the way so that housing is more and more treated as an asset and less as a shelter or a home? If you have any, because if you have like any idea how come we came into this process from the 70s till now.
I mean, I guess the 50s, 60s, and 70s were like this short period in history where the state was forced to also work, to also like act a little bit in the interest of kind of ordinary people, or kind of like of the masses of the people, through like obviously the workers' movement, which was very strong in 50s, 60s, 70s, also in the UK, of course. And I would argue it's just like a political shift within the state, that the state's sole purpose at the moment is to aggressively keep capital accumulation going. Of course, there is a big crisis of capital accumulation. The crisis is yet to be solved. It's like a particularly long crisis already. If we think about it, since the 80s roughly, as in continuous crisis. And the state just needs to make sure for this to continue and to continue and to continue. And of course, the point maybe is that the state does not kind of like realize, oh, housing would be a good commodity to solve the overaccumulation crisis. But you know, like it slowly starts in the 80s. You start selling off some of your council homes, and then like you see, okay, this is working, and then you continue and continue, and maybe like go to even like you take it even you take it further and further and further. And at the moment in the UK, I mean, of course, the economy depends to such a massive extent on housing. A, for capital to find somewhere to expand. B, of course, consumption, like all of those houses need to be furnished. C, people, especially in the UK, people take on, like, if you buy a house for 100,000, maybe like 5 years later it's worth 150,000, and so you can go to the bank and take out additionally 50,000 pounds of mortgage debt against the new value of the house. And the economy depends on quite a large extent also on those additional debts that people get against their higher housing prices, again for consumption. D, I guess there is I don't know how important that is, but in the debate it's often argued that of course people who own houses vote Conservative, and if in the UK you basically only have, with some short interruptions, Conservative governments, so of course Conservative governments will want to increase the rate of home ownership because it will increase their votes. However, in my personal opinion, I think the more important part for the British state is that the economy continues to grow, because that's the origin of the state and that's what the state is for.
For me, the British and also the American example are quite interesting from this more sociological point of view, because it's not only that the state is now locked in, let's say, in the need for housing prices to grow to stimulate the economy, but housing became, after the 70s, especially in the UK, because of the privatization of the 70s and 80s, became one of the main tools of the social integration in the midst of the collapsing of different system of social integration. So while in the past, let's say after the Second World War, the main thing how the citizens were integrated into the, let's say, society was through work. So the idea was that you are a worker, you are a part of the company, your wages will grow in accordance to the productivity of the company, of the productivity of the society, and that was the way how you envisioned your future. So that was the way how you're integrated into the wealth of the society. If the society as a whole will be growing, if the productivity will be growing, your wages will grow and you will be able to afford, I don't know, better things. In the 70s, basically, this system collapsed. And now we all know that the wage system, this normal wage system, as it's called in literature, is something that is not functioning. Most of us are employed precariously, so we are not able to see our employment as something as a vector of stability in our lives. It's something that is extremely unstable, that we cannot depend upon. At the same time, another vector in the past was welfare state, which through different system of social nets, but also like public institutions, were also bringing stability to us. We knew that we can turn to the doctor. We knew that we will have public education. We knew that certain institutions will be there and we can depend on them. While now we are less and less dependent on them. We are less and less certain that we will have, I don't know, good public institutions in 20 years' time. And in this situation, housing after 80s, in this sociological way, became one of vectors of the stability. If you are a homeowner, you at least know that this house is yours, that you can stably live in it. When you repay the mortgage, and especially if you bought your house in the 80s, you repaid your mortgage quite quickly, and you bought it really cheaply, and you knew that the prices will rise and your social mobility will come through, like Christian said, you will be able to get 50,000 additional pounds from that house. And this is the way how, even politically, some parties envisioned how people will get integrated into the system, into the wealth of the system. So if the housing prices will grow, homeowners will be able to sell or resell or remortgage their house, and they will be able to tap into the wealth that they, like social wealth, and in United States pay medical bills, the education of their children. In UK, they will be able to sell their house and move to Spain for the retirement. So what is interesting is that through this how housing was envisioned, it is now basically we are kind of as a society locked in to that we need housing prices to rise, basically, also to not only for the economy to reproduce, but also to reproduce at least our parents' generation, so they are able to reproduce themselves, they're able to afford pensions. But the problem becomes for us now, because we are the generation which we are not able to afford this same kind of scheme. We are not able to become homeowners. Even if we will become homeowners, we will need to pay a lot more money. We'll be indebted really until our 60s. And we are not that certain that housing prices will rise that much in the next 20, 30 years as they did in the last 10 or 20 years in the past. So for a last question, I think it is always necessary for these discussions. It is the question of alternatives. What can be done, especially if we are coming from the Marxist perspective? This is one necessary thing to do. So probably if we can now speculate a little bit, what do we think needs to happen or should happen or could happen to address this issue, and after that we will open the floor for the discussion.
I mean, I guess the easiest, straightforward answer would be build more social housing. I guess if you have a great amount of social housing. Because of one function of social housing in places where you have large amount of social housing is that it is an alternative to the private market, right? So if you have a large amount of social housing and you pay very small amount of rent, it's well maintained, you can live there as long as you want, and it looks nice. There's no reason for anyone to take on either a high mortgage or to go into those precarious rental agreements if you have an option to do something else. So, I mean, the more radical one would, of course, be everyone should get the house in which they're living. But for that, we will have to do a bit more work. But maybe as a social democratic solution, I guess would be to make an alternative and then see how the market reacts to it. And but I mean, of course, even for social democrats, that's the incredible big crux with the housing market. Like, what do you do if you now start I don't know here in Slovenia, but in the UK, if you now start to build loads of social housing, and then the prices of the mortgage, then the prices of the houses go down, then we will have a repetition of 2007, where people have a house worth of 100,000 and a mortgage worth 300,000. It's kind of also really bad for those types of people who didn't have a choice 10 years ago, and now have mortgage debt 3 times higher than the value of the house, and you pay back 300,000 for 100,000 a home, and all of the problems that come with it. So I think the easiest problem would just never take it as far as the UK, because once you're there, it's a bit of kind of like you can't really turn back from it, because so much of the economy depends on it, and you need, like, social democrats like to kind of like engineer the economy in a way to make it work how they think it should. With such a huge housing, kind of like the housing segment is such a huge part of your economy, that engineering becomes incredibly difficult, because once you change one bit, like everything else changes as well, of course. So never take it as far as the UK, and just many very nice social houses.
Basically, your answer is the same as it was in 1870s, when the housing question was written by the Engels. You cannot change housing questions solely by itself. You need to change the whole system if you want to address the housing crisis. Basically, that was your answer. But I see it similarly, because the way I explained before is that right now we are currently we're in a situation in Slovenia, not that much, because we still have quite good public institutions, but in UK, US, for example, where people are dependent on their housing, the value of their houses, for their ability to reproduce or to live their lives in at least some sort of dignity, the falling prices will also mean the falling quality of their life, which means that first thing that you need to do, we need to uncouple housing from the different social systems, so we don't depend on housing prices to get our pensions, to finance our education, to finance our doctors, which is this asset welfare, the idea that was quite strong in the last 20 years. And if you are as a UK or US in a situation, the first thing you need to do, you need to reinforce public institutions and public health and public education and public social systems, so that you have the ability to tackle to housing prices and to lower housing crisis and to lower housing prices without problems for the owners, and the way you explain it, also indebted owners. So we also need the change of financial systems. We are again to the same answer, that we need to change everything if we want to like concretely address housing crisis.
Yeah, because just one more thing, I think it's also important to recognize again that it's even a big social crisis. For like in the UK, you have so many young people, kind of like 30, 35 years of age, with a mortgage of £300,000. So it's like, of course, kind of like they would be better off than me as a renter, but whatever. It is really this aspect of having the mortgages such as...
One interesting, for me at least, and for Slovenian public anecdote is that I think 2 weeks ago, I was part of one media panel about housing, and beforehand they had a short interview with one of the, I wouldn't call him a neoliberal economist, but that sort of direction, neoclassical, neoliberal economist from Faculty of Economics, and he was saying that housing prices are too high. This is really wrong. People are not able to afford their homes. They need to pay their mortgages, and they do not have money to buy different things, and that's why economy is suffering. So it was quite funny for me to listening to someone who probably a year ago would talk about against taxation and against regulation of economy, talking now how housing crisis is affecting economy as a whole. So maybe this is a glimpse of hope that even the, let's say, neoliberal economists are starting to think about housing differently than they did in the past. So now it's what, 6:10. So I can open the floor for questions. Like I said, the regime is you ask the question as loudly as possible. I repeat it. I try to repeat it in the microphone, and then we'll answer it. Yeah. So Nika is asking about the housing cooperatives in general, but more concretely about a project that I'm part of in Slovenia, which is called Zadrugator, which we are now trying for the last, I think now 5 or 6 years to establish first housing cooperative in Slovenia. We had housing cooperatives in between Second and First World War and during Yugoslavia, but those cooperatives were quite different from those that we are envisioning. I think the idea of cooperatives is connected quite nicely to what we were talking about, because main idea of the housing cooperatives that we are envisioning is to decommodify housing. So the idea is that we are able to collectively own units, collectively decide about them, and what is the biggest and the most important thing, we are not, as individuals or as groups, are able to speculate with them and sell them for a higher price in the future. The idea is that you are collective owner of certain units, you decide how they are being used collectively, but you are individually residing in your individual flat. You are a renter basically with indefinite contract with regulated rent until we repay a mortgage, and then after that rent even falls even more. This is the system that is well known in Switzerland, for example, Germany, also in Vienna. There are different informal groups, but also they are also part of the state system. So the idea is, the main thing is basically to become one of, to be similar as a council housing. For example, the difference is that the flats are not owned by the state, but by the group or the collective. Nika also asked about what are the main limitations. First one being is because the housing market is so overheated, and the need for housing cooperatives usually emerges in the situations of overheating of the housing market, so where the housing prices are high, when the land prices are high. We were not able in the last couple of years, and usually these projects are not able to establish cooperatives without public support. So we need state, as a national state or city, to help us establish a project like this, to give us land, to give us funding. And I think that the state should recognize it as a way of that these projects have public functions because they would offer affordable housing indefinitely. So this is one politically also good thing because you're reworking the state, but it is limitation because you need to deal with the state and negotiate, and we were not able to convince politicians of the necessity of the project like this. This is one limitation. The second one is it's a usual limitation, this relation between closed groups and public needs. For example, to talk about it more plastically, there is one really nice housing cooperative in Vienna called Wohnprojekt Wien. It's really nice, quite affordable housing, let's say, but when you go there, you start to be a little bit suspicious because they are integrating inside of the house things that used to be public, like, for example, library or playground or things like that. And these things are now organized and decided upon by this cooperative group, while beforehand they were offered and decided by more general group, which is called public, from the state, let's say, or from the city. This is not a problem by itself, but it can become a problem. It has a possibility to become a problem. Also, problem of exclusion, who is deciding about what, who can enter in the cooperative. These questions then become really, really important. And that is why I said beforehand, it is politically really important. And it's also the biggest potential of the cooperatives is if they are tightly connected to the state. So to the certain public function that is more general as a cooperative is. That is why I think that it always needs to be these individual groups, cooperatives need to be in some way or capacity connected to the public funding, public land that also regulates and controls at least a bit how cooperatives function. Any more questions? Yeah. So I will rephrase, not rephrase, but I will just shorten the question a bit. So the question basically was that there is obviously a need to build more housing, and especially on certain locations like London, for example, or Ljubljana in Slovenia, or basically all capital cities. So there is a need to build more housing. So how are we able to build more housing outside of the current paradigm or current economic interest, let's say? Did I rephrase it correctly? Yeah.
So in Vienna, what they did, for example, they built like kind of because Vienna is actually, as a city, is actually growing quite fast in terms of population. I think at a similar rate to London. Of course, the level is smaller, so the problem in London would be bigger, but also resources are bigger. But what they did is just they built a bit outside of the main city. They just set up a completely new district. Like they built several new housing blocks and a lake, and they extended the metro there. So when you go on the metro, you actually pass by some fields because it's kind of like it's a new part of the city. And they built that now because they know that in 20 years' time, they will kind of like it will probably be eventually full. And they already start there with building all the infrastructure you need if you expand your city, and so on and so forth. So I guess the difficulty, if you want to nudge private companies to build houses, which the same private company can later sell, there you will always get into the contradictions between housing being a commodity on the one hand, to make money, and shelter, and it being shelter on the other hand. So I guess as long as you do it via the private market, I think it is nearly impossible to solve, because if you walk around London in those new districts where there are so many new skyscrapers, most of them are empty. So yeah, I guess the solution would just be for the state directly to like the state building those new homes. There was one thing I wanted to say. Oh yeah, what you also have a problem is in the UK is that the municipalities, so like the regional or kind of like very local governments, they're starved of money, so they're very poor and they kind of like need money in order to provide bins and so on and so forth. And of course, those housing projects are like a major source of their income, as you know. And so that's already maybe like a contradiction, which creates already a problem, that if as a municipality you don't really have many ways of getting in money, and the only way of getting in money is through selling off land, then of course you will sell off the land to the highest bidder, and of course the highest bidder is someone who makes the most money out of the housing project, and providing shelter is just not as profitable as providing empty space.
I can offer three answers to your question. First one is that we cannot think about solving the housing crisis in particular locations without the regional spatial planning. So if we are locked into this capitalist way of regional development, which is geared towards concentration, which is we see in Vienna or London or Ljubljana, we will not be able to solve the housing crisis, because there will always be a lack of supply on certain locations, and the pressure coming from people who are seeking jobs or tourism or spending money in different ways. We will not be able to solve it, and we will always have certain parts of the country with empty houses, destitution, and certain parts of the country which are really, really well off, like Ljubljana or London, but with with unaffordable housing. So this is one. Second one is that we already have quite a lot of housing that is, like we said, being unoccupied, being empty, so speculated upon, or underoccupied, so people with huge mansions and in the center of the city. And there is one really nice analysis from the UK done by Danny Dorling. He said that that in the UK you have more bedrooms per person than any time in the past. So if we count statistically, there is enough housing in UK. It is just distributed wrongly. So the obvious answer would be to redistribute. We did it in Slovenia. It worked quite well after the Second World War. But it is a thing that we should be. It is obviously a thing that we should be thinking about. And the third one, I think that we need to start thinking about how to entice these huge financial flows, financial capital flows, and huge excess of money. I don't know the data about how much money is in Slovenian banks by citizens. It's a crazy amount of money, in the tens of billions of euros. So there is a lot of capital being I can even say wasted. We as a society, and especially state, needs to develop schemes to entice the investment of this money into an affordable housing, with tax breaks, with offering land, with subsidizing, the way basically how understand the Vienna is also doing, so that the private companies are investing in affordable housing because they get tax breaks, subsidies. It is a tricky relationship, but it is a thing that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, I think that actually I wanna connect to that because you said it's a waste of capital when you buy those when you build those empty flats, and I think that's happening in London on a great scale. Is that stuff is built which doesn't really have much purpose or value. And I mentioned David Harvey earlier. He calls it he refers to New York City, and he calls it stupid, mindless urbanization. And he says that Marx talked about militarism, so about about militarism. It's like when you put capital into militarism, into building weapons, it's the same as dumping capital into the ocean, because that's not from a moral perspective, but it's from a perspective of usually as a capitalist you would buy new and better machinery, and productivity of society increases because that's like the function of competition. So usually you invest your capital into machinery, and the whole of the society gets better at producing more with less effort, which we can say is something good, ecologically maybe something different. And so militarism is something where you just dump it into the ocean, because of course through military equipment there's not much, like you don't produce tables better if you produce weapons. And housing is the same thing. Is when you build empty flats and empty massive complexes everywhere, it's the same as putting the capital into the ocean, because there's no use of it, there's complete waste of it. And so it's about this, taking this capital, and instead of wasting it putting it into the ocean, maybe building shelter.
We have probably time for one really quick question if anyone is really interested in something. So the question was that we talked mostly about the ownership, let's say, and less about when we talked about alternatives. Yeah? So less about what renters can do. So the most obvious thing is if you are in UK, you should join a renters union. If you are in country without a renters union, you should form a renters union, because the idea is that if the state is not protecting our rights, which are inscribed in laws, or if the laws are bad, we need to find different ways to protect our shelters. And unions, I saw one important union member here. So unions are the the institutions that protect, not only protect but also make conditions of workers better. It's not just protecting the current law, but making better laws also. That's the function of union. And the same goes with housing. In the past, really nice example is British example of housing regulation. It started from the renters' strike in Edinburgh, or no, in Glasgow. Yeah, Glasgow renters' strike. So Glasgow renters' strike during the First World War was the push that pushed the state to enforce certain rent regulation, and the same is today. We need to build institutions, organizations that will protect concrete tenants. So in concrete cases, as UK renters unions are already doing it, and also force the state to change the way it is operating. Because the state is not a benevolent institution that does good things by itself. It is dependent on the social forces in the society, and we need to develop institutions that will force the state to do something good. So this is basically the main thing that we can do. So form or join a renters union.
Yeah, and in the UK, I think recently students in the last 2 or 3 years had a couple of successful rent strikes. So there were a couple of successful organizations where they went on rent strike for the student accommodation. So kind of like it's obviously something different, much smaller, much easier to to attack. But there are also like success stories in of joining together.
Okay, so we need to finish now. We are followed by the next talk. I can't remember what it is. I think it's something about welfare state from the people that are gathering in the background. It is. So talk about the welfare state. I will also like to. I don't think this is correct for me to do, invite you to another event that is happening now at 7. I need to do it because it's organized by Zadrugator. There is another discussion about housing at 7 at Muzejska Ploščad and opening of the statue of the housing crisis at the 7 o'clock. Sorry for the speakers and the organizer that I'm using my mic for this announcement also. So thank you for coming, and I hope it was at least a bit interesting. So.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank Christian for coming. Yeah.